This is the Writers Are People Too podcast, where I just can't get writers to shut up. Tonight, we have with us scholar, commentator, columnist, and of course, author, Charlotte Dalwood. So, Charlotte, give me a little bit of information about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Charlotte. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I am the author of Until at Dawn We Wake, Gender Madness Theology, which is coming out from Choir Books on December 10th, 2024. I consider myself a perpetual student. I have a Master's of Arts in Religion from Yale University, Juris Doctor from the University of Calgary Faculty of Law, and I'm currently a Master of Laws student at Osgoode Hall Law School of York University in Toronto. I'm also doing what is functionally a legal apprenticeship. I'm Canadian, and in order to become a lawyer in Canada, you need to do what's called articles, where you work for a year as a very, very junior, almost lawyer. And so I'm doing that as well at a law firm that represents people who have been mistreated by the prison and policing systems here in Canada.
Gotcha. Yeah, quite the resume. And actually, that was leading me right into my first question, which is you have quite a bit of education at various institutions. So most people, when they want to learn something, just like go to YouTube or whatever. Like, what's making you want to formally pursue all this education?
Well, I like to think of it like the old proverb, as iron sharpens iron. So for me, it's about surrounding myself with people who are committed to excellence and high caliber scholarship, because that's the kind of work that I want to do myself. And I really think that it's by surrounding yourself with other leaders, intellectually, spiritually, socially, that you can develop those kinds of leadership skills yourself. And so I've pursued formal education. I think not for the pieces of paper, but for the kinds of people that education lets me work with. I think of education very much as a experience of formation. So it's not just about checking boxes in order to meet degree requirements. It's about shaping who you are as a person, by putting yourself through particular programs. And so the kind of person I want to be is very thoughtful, is very considered, and of course, you don't have to have a formal education to have those qualities, but I do think that a formal education is one of the ways in which you can really cultivate those attributes.
Awesome. That was I think you must have prepared for that question. I didn't even send that to you. You just had it outlined perfectly. So, you did mention you're from Canada, and I've been to Canada a couple times, but I am by no means familiar with the political, religious, and social climates of Canada versus the United States. So do you have any thoughts on what the differences between our two countries are and how they relate to each other?
Well, I definitely think that Canada follows the United States in a lot of ways culturally. So where the United States goes, Canada is sure to follow, in its own way. But Canadians take for granted things that Americans don't, politically and culturally. So for politically, the best example would be something like universal public health care. Canadians just take for granted that you should have that. The government should be providing that service. And so it's only fairly recently, I think, that we've seen conservative parties really try to challenge that assumption. Partially, I think, because of moves towards greater deregulation and government withdrawal from the kind of social welfare state in the United States. So definitely Canada is informed by American political developments. So we see that with the rise of more populist political figures in the United States, we're seeing a similar uptick in conservative populism here in Canada, and that hasn't totally played out in the electoral politics, but I think in the next few years we're going to see more and more of that. So different countries, but definitely affecting one another.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, we are neighbors after all, so it's going to happen.
Yes.
This is a slight digression, I guess, but as there's the ongoing debate in the United States, should we have socialized healthcare, et cetera? People always point to other countries and they say, it is or isn't working for them. Canada is one of these countries. And I'm just curious on your opinion, your perspective of what you've experienced. People will always say, Canada has socialized medicine, but the quality and the speed of which you get the care is so terrible compared to the United States. Just for my curiosity, what's your experience been like?
Well, I lived in the United States for 3 years, so when I was at Yale, so I have some experience of both the Canadian medical system and the American medical system. And I have to say, it's true that I was I was able to get appointments with specialists faster when I was living in the United States than I have here in Canada. But I was terrified of the American medical system when I was living in the United States. I was so afraid that I would uh, transgress the limits of my insurance coverage and that I would end up with a
Yeah.
huge bill. So I guess the difference for me is that I might have to wait for healthcare here in Canada, although not really that long, but I might have to. But at least I will go to see a doctor
Hmm.
without really having to worry about it.
Yeah. I earlier this year I had an appendectomy, emergency, of course. And I have gotten a couple small bills, but I was notified by my insurance that I could be on the hook for quite a bit. And every time the mail truck drives by, I just get a little shiver and I tense up a little
Yeah.
bit. So we'll see what happens. So your book, Until at Dawn We Wake: Gender, Madness, and Theology. What does the title Until at Dawn We Wake mean?
Yeah, so the title refers to the overarching arc, theological arc that the book explores. So Christian theology is often told in terms of this story of, the creation of the world, the fall into sin, the redemption of the world, and then some kind of what we would call theologically an eschatological horizon, the end of all things, where things will be set right, etc., etc. Judgment will happen. All the things we associate with the end times. Until at dawn we wake refers to that period that we live through this side of the end of all things. So while we're still asleep, I guess, while we're still living through this dark night where there's so much turmoil and trouble and strife, and it's referring to that moment and saying we're still here and we need to wrestle with what it means to live in this moment, but we still have our eyes set on what is to come, and we still want to wait with hope, because I think the book is fundamentally an exercise in hope for this time when we are going to wake up and find a brighter day ahead of us.
Hmm. So you have a Master of Arts in religion. What do you practice a religion at all, or what's the lens that you're coming at this topic with?
So I come at this topic as someone who was raised evangelical Christian, who is trained in Christian theology, and particularly in what we would consider more mainline Protestant theology, so Anglican and Calvinist theologies, but who has since actually, while writing this book, converted to Judaism. And so I write this book as kind of a loving farewell letter to the evangelicals who raised me, the Anglicans who taught me, and all the people who've touched my religious life through the years, saying, okay, I'm gonna I think of theology and this book as an exercise in theology, as a kind of dialogue where Christians have been talking to me my whole life, and this is my chance to talk back to them. And so that's what I'm doing in this book, but I do it as someone who's certainly not a Christian anymore.
Hmm. So this conversion from Christianity to Judaism, would you say that it was a quote unquote a logical transformation? Was it a relational, emotional transformation? Hey, there's these Jewish people in my life that are really calling to me to come to their religion, or was it more of like a spiritual realization that you had?
It's definitely more relational. For me, I think that you can find God pretty much anywhere if you know how to look. But good people are hard to find. Good communities are hard to find. And I had the good fortune of falling in with some very good Jewish people. And um, it was out of a desire really to continue on my spiritual journey in their company that I decided that I wanted to formally become Jewish. Now I accept quite a bit of Jewish theology, whatever that means, since Judaism is so much about wrestling with God and wrestling with one another about God.
Mm.
But I've come to uh, adopt Jewish ways of thinking about things like the necessity of Sabbath rest, about the necessity of arguing with God being fairly paramount to that. But at root, it's always been about people and the people I want to be in relationship with.
Awesome. So you say your book, quote, examines three of the centering points of Christian theology: creation, sin, and redemption, by asking what light, gender dysphoria, and psychosis can shed on the Christian religious experience. So I'm curious what your definitions of light, gender dysphoria, and psychosis are in this case.
Yeah, so for me, I think about them I come at them in fairly clinical terms. So gender dysphoria being the felt incongruence between the gender you identify with and the sex you were assigned at birth, which is something I experienced, and which is had led me. That felt incongruence is what led me to embark on a gender transition myself. I'm a trans woman, so I um, have done something about that felt incongruence. And then psychosis is really a breakdown in your ability to uh, parse reality. And so I think of it in terms of venturing through the realm of the unreal, I think is a phrase I use in the book. There are symptoms of this, of course: hallucinations, delusions, cognitive issues that come with psychosis. I've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, so that's how my particular psychosis manifests. And so it's really thinking, starting from these fairly clinical understandings of those terms, but then trying to get at them from my own experience of them. So of being trans, of experiencing psychosis, and then using those, kind of inroads to really reinterpret Christian theology in light of my personal experience.
So, going on, you say, are schizophrenia and related psychotic illnesses forms of neurodivergence, and what difference does it make for our doctrine of creation? So, how does the doctrine of creation in your eye play into all of this?
Well, so we need to think about creation in terms of difference. That when I think about creation, and throughout this entire book, I'm thinking about. I really keep coming back to the story of creation in Genesis, that kind of Edenic narrative that we have in those first few chapters of the Bible, and what we see in that particular narrative is creation framed in terms of the creation of different creatures, different people, and then God looks upon all of creation in having separated out creatures, having separated out light from dark, having done all this separation, and says it's good. And so what I want to do is try to wrestle with that statement and say, what does it mean for difference to be good in a world in which there's so much discrimination along the lines of difference, where so many people look at difference of whatever kind and say difference is bad, that people who look different, sound different, that we perceive as different in whatever way are somehow bad or flawed or evil. And so what I want to do is go back to that root story of creation and say, well, if God looked upon this as good, how can we also look upon these differences as good? So I use the particular example of schizophrenia and the schizophrenia spectrum, because there's kind of a cluster of psychotic illnesses that are captured by that
Mm-hmm.
diagnostic label today. And I try to say, well, if these are different ways of experiencing the world, of going through the world, of living life and being human, how can we look upon them not as these fundamental flaws or defects, but actually as these good things that are part of the human experience that need to be accommodated, especially, on a social level, on an
Hmm.
interpersonal level, and in individual lives.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me right into my next question, which is, you mentioned an ongoing crisis plaguing Christian churches. So what is this crisis, and is this crisis what ultimately led you to step away from Christianity?
Yeah, so the crisis is nothing other than the documented rates at which people in positions of leadership in Christian churches, and my particular focus here is mainline churches, particularly the Episcopal Church, but where there's a documented higher rates of sexual abuse and other kinds of discrimination, but sexual abuse is my particular focus here. And in one of the chapters in the book, I do document the higher rates at which 2S LGBTQ plus people are sexually abused in various ways by Episcopal clergy. And this has mostly not been discussed elsewhere. And so this is, a crisis that's unfolding outside of the public eye for the most part. Though I think for many people on the inside of the church, it's something that is somewhat of an open secret. And it's something that I experienced. So I talk in the book a little bit about my own experience working at an Episcopal church where I experienced what I would consider to be harassing behavior and discriminatory behavior on account of my gender identity. And that really soured me to Christianity for a simple reason. I was taught growing up that the point of being Christian is to have a relationship with God that transforms your life. So you become holier in this life because of your relationship with God. And I assumed that those with the strongest relationship with God, i.e., clergy, would therefore be the holiest people among us. And that's just unfortunately not the case. And so
Yeah.
when that belief was really shattered, I really had to think about, well, what kind of people do I want to be around? And so I ended up, that's where, like I was saying earlier, I ended up building relationships outside of the church.
Hmm. Yeah, and I can tell that this relational aspect of it is very important for you. And obviously, this next question is somewhat hypothetical. But do you think that if you found that relational aspect in Christianity, that you would have ever stepped away?
Oh, yeah. If I had built the relationships with other Christians instead of with Jews, might I have
Hmm.
stayed Christian?
Yeah.
I think it's possible. Though I will say that I think that the problem of, clergy abusing congregants and others is more of a theological problem in Christianity, particularly in forms of Christianity like Anglicanism, which the Episcopal Church is one branch, because there's this doctrine that the clergy person, the priest, stands what we would call in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, when they stand at the front, in front of the altar for, say, the Eucharist. So there's this actual idea that the clergy person like channels God and kind of stands in the position of Jesus Christ before the congregants. And so it's a real problem when you have this person who stands in the person of Jesus Christ then going on to abuse
Yeah.
congregants. That's more of a theological problem than I think in other even strands of Christianity, but certainly in other religions where you don't have that theological construct to wrestle with.
Yeah. No, that 100% makes sense. Um, did you want to read an excerpt from one of your essays?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll read a bit from chapter 1, which really situates my experience of psychosis and uses it to start to begin to think through my theological thoughts about God and the church. So it's called I, Ezekiel. At my sickest, I believed myself to be the reincarnation of the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel. I spent hours poring over the prophet's eponymous Old Testament text. Every word, every verse contained a message just for me. I was a prophet, chosen by God to carry a message of doom to the people. But first I had to prove myself and receive my prophetic word. Quote, Then God said to me, Son of man, eat this scroll I am giving you and fill your stomach with it. So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth. End quote. That's Ezekiel 3:3. Just as God commanded, I tore pages out of my Bible and consumed them, and they filled me with a warmth I've only ever felt during the clearest moments of connection with the divine. More than any other Old Testament prophet, Ezekiel's eccentric, at times bizarre, visions and behaviors have inspired posthumous speculation about his psychological state. Catalepsy, seizures, hysteria, all of these and more have been proposed as after-the-fact diagnoses. But the one that resonates most closely with me is the diagnostic sign under which I travel: schizophrenia. Quote, like the writings of schizophrenics, wrote Edwin Broom Jr. in an influential mid-20th century article for the Journal of Biblical Literature, the writings of Ezekiel are difficult to follow. Rules of ordinary logic simply do not apply. End quote. Stretches of catatonic freezing, paranoid worries about being rejected by the people of Israel, and, of course, the supernatural voices that he hears, all indicate that Ezekiel was on the schizophrenia spectrum, or so scholars like Broom would have us believe. And maybe they're right. But if so, so what? Does it matter one way or the other if Ezekiel was mad? Does it matter if I am? So that's how the book opens.
Awesome. I love that. I love that last part where you say, does it matter if I am? Very thought-provoking. So a question about your perspective on gender dysphoria as it affects yourself and other people. Would you say that it is the way that God created you? Would you say that it is two spirits inhabiting a single body? Would you say that it is a form of mental illness? Would you say that it is any number of things? What's your perspective on why people are experiencing this?
Well, I certainly don't run away from the idea that gender dysphoria is a mental illness the way that some people do. And that's partly because I don't think that mental illness is such a bad thing. Obviously, it's something that causes a lot of havoc in people's lives. It's something that must be, struggled with, dealt with. But being mentally ill doesn't make you bad or evil or wrong. And so I don't want to run away from, and stigmatize the mentally ill by saying, oh, well, I have gender dysphoria, but it's not like what other people, what those crazy people experience. As someone who's, lived with psychosis, which is in many ways the definition of crazy, I don't want to stigmatize that experience. At the same time, and so maybe related to that, I do want to say that I think God did create me to be Charlotte, but did create me to grow into that identity. So it's something that, I think of gender dysphoria is this felt incongruence, as I said, between the sex you were assigned at birth and the gender with which you identify. So it's kind of a psychological fact. You experience this distress. It doesn't necessarily make you trans. Being trans means you're doing something about the gender dysphoria. And I like to think that, God made me however God made me, but I get to choose what to do with that fact. And so what I'm doing is being trans, and it's a beautiful way to inhabit the world. And I wouldn't want to take it away. So.
Well, yeah, thanks for the clarification. My final question for you. You call this a series of compelling essays. So broadly speaking, what are you trying to convince the reader of?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to convince them, at most importantly, that it's okay and good to talk back to the tradition with which that you come from and that raised you. So the reason I structured my book the way I did, in terms of this Christian story of creation, fall, redemption, is because I wanted to give my own life a kind of structure and significance. So I wanted to say, I'm not just telling stories about things I've been through. I actually want to say that my life matters for others. It matters for the larger Christian story. it says something about that story, and indeed it might shape that story in its own way. And so I think that I would want other people to feel empowered, to have to engage in similar exercises, to talk back to Christianity, to talk back to whatever religion that raised them, to use the structures of theological thought in those religions to, structure their own life stories, so that they can see how their own life stories inflect the structures that raise them. So I really want to model a kind of discourse here that I would encourage other people to engage in their own way.
If you had one final thing to say to Christianity and Christians as a whole, of how they treat your community, what would that be?
I'd say that, I think it's impossible for me to ever leave Christianity behind, and that means that I have every bit of a right to keep doing Christian theology and keep talking back to Christians as people who still identify as Christian right now.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, everybody. We had Charlotte Dalwood.
Thank you.